Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our Idea Summit. We are going to begin appropriately with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if we could rise, and if you could direct your attention to the flag. We pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks to Lindsay Craig and her team at NRI for planning this wonderful event. And let the record show, thank you. Let the record show that our faith in the power and the attraction of conservative ideas is so deep and so abiding that we scheduled the 2 days of the summit up against the first 2 days of the NCAA tournament. And I am actually making the sacrifice of giving these opening remarks during the midway point of UVA's game against the Cretans at UNC Wilmington. So the last time we had one of these gatherings in Washington, D.C., we did it under a broad rubric of optimism about the prospects of conservatism in this country. A little did we imagine, especially as among his fiercest critics in the primaries, that the instrument of achieving some of these really important priorities would be none other than Donald J. Trump. But as the Bard said, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. For conservatism, Donald Trump represents an opportunity and a potential crisis. The opportunity is not just unspooling some of the damage of the last 8 years, but it is creating a more grounded republicanism. We have learned over the last year and a half that the House of Reagan had grown creaky and somewhat decrepit. So that's why Donald Trump could show up and blow down the door with relative ease. Many conservatives seem to think that the highest end of American politics was trying constantly to rerun the 1980s over and over again. Donald Trump did not believe that. The Republican Party needed to become more populist, and Trump now is reorienting it in a very useful way toward workers, towards a greater emphasis on wages, and is wrenching it away from the lazy elite consensus on issues like immigration. That's all to the good. The potential crisis is one, potentially letting ourselves lose touch with fundamental premises that will end up landing us in places that aren't remotely conservative and aren't good for the country. And two, letting ourselves chase down the rabbit hole after President Trump's wilder meanderings, some of which tend to occur when he experiences, as we all do, that existential crisis when you're alone and you think the universe is arrayed against you and your only source of comfort seems to be your phone or your Twitter feed. So we think the appropriate attitude and posture towards Trump, it's neither mindless hostility nor unthinking assent. It has never been the policy of National Review to subjugate our conscience or our intellect to one man, no matter who that man was. This wasn't true of Ronald Reagan, whose administration at times we frankly and harshly criticized. And there are old Reagan hands who still remember this to this day. You can have a very animated conversation with former Secretary of State George Shultz about some of these criticisms, as I did a few months ago. So what I think we should be doing, we should be widening our ideological aperture enough to take account of what Donald Trump achieved last November, which was truly remarkable. But at the same time, we can't forget what it is that makes us conservatives in the first place, namely a commitment to limited government and to ordered liberty, which means we're skeptical of government, and we're also insistent on individual responsibility, and the social structures that make it possible. So in sum, this means thinking about what, if anything, needs to be discarded from our orthodoxies. It means thinking about what needs to be rethought and perhaps reformulated. And it means thinking about what needs to be strenuously reaffirmed. Hence this event. You will hear on the next 2 days from never-Trumpers and from Trump officials and from everywhere, from everyone in between, addressing these very questions in a program that is designed not to skate over or paper over conservative divisions, but instead to discuss them and, when appropriate, to argue about them. Now, it's not news, I'm sure, to anyone that the last year or so on the right has been very chippy and at times quite ugly. And this conference, among other things, is devoted to the proposition that we can disagree, perhaps sharply, but do it civilly and do it in a spirit of mutual commitment to advancing the American project. And with that, let's get underway and begin what I hope will be a big, fat, beautiful idea summit. Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon. Let the arguing and debating begin. We've got a great panel today and a great program overall. There should be notes on your table where you can write down questions for the second half of our panel. You've got the bios of our great panelists, so I'm not going to go through an introduction, but instead get right to it and ask our panelists, starting with Heather, how you think this new administration is going so far.
I'm here for point of contrast. I think it's going quite well. I am been very pleased. I attended the inauguration, and instead of backtracking, I saw a reaffirmation of commitment to promised results. I've seen the appointment of people whom I think it's hard to think of a cabinet selection process where one has been more uniformly pleased, particularly the judicial appointment or the nomination of Gorsuch, I think has been heartwarming to many conservatives. You have the beginnings of the definition of, I think, the battle of our lifetimes. If you think about it, the two great new developments of the left were the regulatory state and the entitlement state. And I would add to that a third thing, which is a redefinition of the role of the judiciary. And Trump is about to make it very clear that he is taking on all three, but the entitlement state will wait for last. Because the regulatory state is obviously more important. It's where the academy lives. It is the core of what the sort of genesis of the anger of the left. It's part of why they're so upset. And the whole business now with the executive orders and the recent decision by Hawaii is helping tee up a brilliant argument that we can have about the proper role of the courts. So I think overall I am quite pleased with how this is going.
Henry?
I think Trump has done a magnificent job of encouraging and rallying and unifying his supporters. I think his emphasis in judicial appointments, his emphasis on the travel ban have been, and particularly his continued battles with the left-wing media, have served to unite the people who were open or likely to have backed him to begin with. I do not think that he has yet persuaded the people in the middle, the people who largely chose not to vote for either Clinton or Trump. And that's this voter that ultimately will decide whether or not he's reelected. I think he remains a unknown, not an unknown, but a ambiguous figure to those people, and I don't think he's made progress with them. I do think that one of the ways he's done the unification of his backers is by deferring some of the hardest questions, that there is a tension between the activist sense of government that Trump conveyed to his supporters, particularly the 5.5 million people who had voted for Obama in 2012, who voted for him in 2016, that gave him the presidency, and the more limited government sense of the traditional conservative movement, which is more dominant in Congress. Those questions need to be worked out, and they will be worked out over the next few months, and we'll see whether or not that unity prevails and whether or not Trump will become more of a salesman for traditional conservatism, which causes problems with his more populist, less conservative voters, or whether or not he'll actually be moving towards a redefinition of conservatism that will incorporate more activism than this movement has traditionally found acceptable.
I think it's mixed. I think some of what Heather said is right. I think on the personnel side, there have been some very good appointments. Gorsuch, I think, is primus inter pares among those, but you've had McMaster and Mattis, Francis Collins at NIH, Tom Price, and others. So I think on the personnel side, particularly as it relates to non-White House, but cabinet posts, there I think it's been good, relatively good. Then there's, I would say, the second area is the competence side. There I don't think it's so good. You had the executive order, the initial one that was rolled out, and that was obviously done very poorly. It was rammed through by Steve Miller, intentionally kept out of the loop the people that needed to be in the loop. They had to pull it back and try it again. We'll see whether round two gets through. The healthcare rollout's been rocky, to say the least. And if you talk to Hill Republicans, and you've probably done this more than I have, but I've talked to enough, just trying to deal with the Trump administration and the Trump White House is just very difficult. It's extremely chaotic. The degree of its vitriol and backbiting this early in administration among White House people, the leaks and all of the rest, is quite extraordinary and really probably unprecedented in my memory. And that, I think, is problems, because you have to have the competence to be able to run. And remember, this is still, I think we're about 55 days in. These are the easy days. They get harder from here on out. And then I think the third area is the area that has concerned me most about Donald Trump, which is temperamental and characterological. And there, I think he is what I assumed he would be, and I'm alarmed by it. I know other people are not. And there's a style and approach that he has and a worldview that he has. And some people love it and find it energizing and encouraging. I do not. And I've made my case any number of times about that. And time will tell who was right. My suspicion is in the end that those characterological and temperamental problems that I see, and which I'm quite convinced aren't going to change, will ultimately hurt and maybe even consume the Trump presidency. The other thing I'd say, just on the political side, I agree with Henry. He's energized his base, and I don't think you can overstate the degree to which, when Donald Trump goes after what is referred to as the mainstream media with a pickaxe, they will overlook any number of ideological transgressions because they are so thrilled to have somebody fight the way that they perceive him to be fighting. I have a feeling that he's sort of exhausting the country. He's been in there 55 days. It seems longer than that. And that kind of intensity and that pace and the conflict and that sort of in-your-face element. I don't know that he is expanding the base that he has. Rather, he's reinforcing it, but I wonder at this early stage, and it's very early, whether the people that he's eventually going to need to broaden the coalition are being turned off, but time will tell.
Lots of things that we can discuss further, lots of directions we could go. I want to pick up on one particular strand of what we're talking about. It's something that Henry was talking about in terms of some of the tensions between Trumpism, let's say, and traditional limited government conservatism. There's always a temptation or a danger, particularly in the Republican Party, that everybody becomes so identified with whoever's the number one guy. I think we saw that during the George W. Bush administration, when a lot of us who had disagreements with some of his ideas felt that he was changing conservatism in a direction we didn't completely like. During Trump's quasi-State of the Union address, it was interesting that you had basically a plea for protectionism, and you had all these Republicans applauding it, standing up for it. That's something that I personally find concerning, but I wonder whether you think that some of these changes are more salutary, or maybe they're changes that won't last or are only skin deep. Whoever wants to take that one up.
Well, yeah, I'll jump in on that. The challenge exists that the Republican coalition as it existed before Donald Trump is not a majority coalition. The coalition between social conservatives and small government conservatives and business conservatives was not enough to carry a national election, although it could dominate certain regions. What Donald Trump did was add the missing element, which was appeal to the blue-collar, non-Republican who traditionally wants a more activist role for government. And all of these data were out there years ahead of time. He was the only one of the candidates who actually picked up on this desire and campaigned like a laser to bring these people into the coalition. And guess what? He produced the Electoral College majority. There's no majority without incorporating these voters. So the question is the terms of the incorporation. And I don't think conservatives should suddenly become protectionists. But on the other hand, I think ignoring concerns about free trade's effect on people and communities, the way conservatives have tended to do in the last 20 years, was politically unsalutary. I think focusing on entitlements as a problem of cost rather than a problem of how to make sure that people get the help they need at the time when they need it is one that's doomed to failure. And how you reconcile that with the traditional conservatives' beliefs is very, very important. But if you don't, we will be looking at a center-left government as far as the eye can come, because if we pose the question without bringing these voters in, they will be able to form a majority.
I think that you will see significant changes. I think one of the changes that you'll see, first and foremost, is because Trump, as best I can tell, is not an ideological anything except his ideology is results. So he's going to be looking for those things that best help him achieve keeping his promises, which is his new mantra, and how he pushes back against what one could predict are going to be the attacks of the left, that his policies hurt the very people who he was trying to help. But he will be saying all the time that I've kept my promise to you. And in the process of doing that, I think he's going to be shifting the conservative focus to becoming, or at least the Republicans, becoming the party of the working man. And you're going to be left with the Democrats being the party of the elitists and then those who don't work at all. And it's in a sense, it's almost Reaganite, right? Because part of what made Reagan so good was that he hadn't grown up as a conservative. So he didn't talk about businessmen, almost never. If you go back through his writings, I think he used the word entrepreneur twice. If you look at his arguments for his different policies, they were never in terms of dollars and what they did for the business economy. They were always in terms of the average guy coming home from the factory or the gas station or wherever he happened to work and what it meant to his pocketbook. And so you're going to see that shift. I just want to go back to one thing you said. I'm curious.
And I want to jump in for a second.
Yeah. How many of you, given something that both Henry and Pete said, how many of you did not vote for Trump? Okay, and of those of you who did not vote for Trump, how many of you woke up the next morning feeling actually kind of relieved and surprised that you felt so relieved and surprised that it wasn't Hillary? Yes, so I think that there's been some movement, and as people see that Trump is not necessarily our worst fear. I personally went through a 36-hour period where I was sure that Smoot-Hawley was in our future. This was back in June, May-June, when I thought he was certainly now definitely going to be the nominee. And in talking to people who were economic advisors to the Trump campaign, came away very much convinced that that was not what was actually going to happen, that what you would have is a renegotiation of deals to achieve more favorable terms than we presently have, but it would not be, they seem to be very cognizant of, the 1920s Smoot-Hawley downside story. So it's not protectionism as it was previously practiced, which is why I think you saw Republicans standing.
I wrote a book that's coming out in June on the working class Republican Ronald Reagan and the return of blue-collar conservatism. And that's exactly what he did, is that he spoke in the language of the Democrats, Franklin Roosevelt. He talked as an interpreter of that legacy to move it towards freedom, but not in openly rejecting it. And that was the secret sauce that made millions of what we now know as Reagan Democrats come over and vote for him, first in 2 elections as governor of California, and then in both of his elections for president. He was an unconventional conservative, and that was exactly why he could win where other conservatives failed. And Trump is the first person, despite all of his idiosyncrasies and character issues, which I don't want to minimize, but he's the first Republican since Ronald Reagan to speak that language.
Right.
I'd jump into a couple things. I agree to some extent. I think Donald Trump is ideologically rootless. That's one of my concerns about him because I'm a conservative. But one of the issues where he's actually been consistent throughout his entire public life has been protectionism. He's been a fierce protectionist for really 25 or 30 years. And he's got a number of people in his administration that are. So I think that's where he wants to drive the country, and that was a theme in the campaign. I think the question is whether the Republicans in the House and Senate are going to mitigate those tendencies. In the end, you're for or against free trade, for or against protectionism, not because of abstract ideological reasons. You believe that it helps increase economic activity and human flourishing or not. And that's really, so the argument here is not whether one has to be ideologically pure or not, it's whether you think free trade in some is better than protectionism. I think it is. Almost everyone who's been conservative for a great long while has. Heather's right when she says that he's going to be judged on his results. I'm not sure he's going to be judged on whether he keeps his promises, because he's made promises that are contradictory, way beyond what any other candidate has. He's constantly shifting on what he's going to do. He's going to do mass deportation. He's not. His health care plan is going to do one thing, it's going to do the other. So he's constantly shifting around. But it is true that in the end, people are judged by results, what happens on your watch. And that gets back in part to my point about competence. He's made a series of promises, particularly to low and middle class Americans, and he's now got to produce. It's different to make those claims in a campaign. It matters when you're governing, and you can't point the finger at other people. And if, 2, 3, 4 years into the Trump presidency, the economy is growing at 3.5%, and the government is running efficiently, and healthcare is better than it is than he inherited, that the international situation has calmed down, that ISIS is on a retreat, there have been no attacks, and people just feel better about their lives and the direction of their country, then he's likely to win again, and he's likely to fundamentally redefine the Republican Party and conservatism. If that doesn't happen, if he begins to go down, if he begins to collapse, and he's pulled down either by incompetence or by the temperamental and characterological issues, then there will be a break. And the way this always happens is movements, if it's conservatism with a Republican president, if it's liberalism with a Democratic president, they will separate themselves from that person because they don't want their movement to go down with the politician that they viewed as failed. And we just don't know. We all have inclinations on how he's going to, how things are going to turn out, but time will tell.
I'm going to try to get my own 2 cents in, using my moderator's prerogative. On the trade issue, I wonder if there's a possible synthesis between your views and Pete's, in that I agree that Trump's protectionism is consistent and longstanding, but I also don't think it's been very detailed. So, for example, he's railed against NAFTA for 2 decades, but he's never really explained what he would have done differently, how he wants it changed. So it seems to me that we've got an impulse here that can be expressed in more or less destructive forms, and that it may be that we don't get the worst possible outcome, like Smoot-Hawley, both because he's not quite that detailed a believer in this, and because there are other people in his administration and other people in the Republican Party who have a different view of it. But one other question that we've been talking about to some degree here, when you think about some of the, let's say, the core Trump voters, there were a lot of different kinds of Trump voters, and people often flatten them into one sort of caricature. But it's certainly true he overperformed among white voters without college degrees, often people who were not religiously affiliated. We've read a lot in the last couple of years about some of the social problems that are afflicting people in these especially rural communities. And I wonder if you think that there's anything that is possible to do, whether it's a regular conservative agenda or the Trump agenda or any other agenda, that is actually going to heal some of these problems that these communities are facing? Or are they doomed to be disillusioned by the results?
I think what you need to show is progress, not an overnight solution. Franklin Roosevelt built a political dynasty that lasted 4 decades on the premise that bold, persistent experimentation to try and help people in need was the function of the federal government. It didn't work overnight. Unemployment was still 10% 8 years after he took office. But
So we need to start a world war, is what you're saying.
What I'm saying is that
You need to show that you're trying.
what you need to do, that voters will understand as long as people have their backs, that results are harder to come by. But one of the things I think we need to look very carefully at is not trying to get jobs to go to people, but get people to go to jobs. That we are creating jobs that these people could take, but they're not in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and they're not in Marquette, Michigan. They're in Greenville, South Carolina. They're in Laredo, Texas. They're in places that they would have to move to. And before we had a social safety net, people moved hundreds of miles with low skills out of necessity. Now they don't, because they can make a go of it, because we have a balkanized system that encourages people to stay put to get government benefits. We conservatives can change that and encourage Americans to get moving, the Americans to move so that America can get moving.
It goes to another challenge. Conservatives tend to focus on this or that policy fight, and the left is much more focused on the culture war. And ultimately, the culture war determines a lot of responses to policy fights. The millennials are coming up as a generation, and as a cohort, they're exhibiting some very different tendencies and proclivities. Not all of them, of course, and we all know exceptions to the broad generalities, but overall, it's a different expectation of life. It's a different approach. We can either figure out how to be persuasive with them, or we can figure that we're going to lose in the long run. I think it was Aristotle who said, "Show me a nation's songs and I'll tell you its laws." Or I'm paraphrasing badly, but that was the gist of it. And it's...
If it's not Aristotle, it's better.
It's Plato, but Plato.
Was it Plato?
Yeah.
I much prefer Aristotle. I wish
So
it
do,
were
so do I, but Plato was a poet, so that's why
Okay.
he preferred poets.
But there is a truth to that, and we have neglected the culture, or we have sort of pounded our fist and ranted at the culture without figuring out how to get into it and actually make inroads as much as we should have. And I think that might be part of the problems, the breakdowns that you're seeing in some of these communities.
So in your opening remarks, your answer to my first question, you were talking about a lot of the things you like about the Trump administration so far, but then really highlighting questions of character as the places where you have the biggest problems with President Trump. And it seems like there's a little bit of a disjunction there, because normally one would say that character is revealed in action, but you seem to like a lot of the action. So are you sure about your assessment of either his character or how much it matters?
Am I sure about his character? We'll see. I mean, it could turn out that he's an amazingly decent person who has this fidelity to truth and respects women and acts with grace and rather than vindictiveness, and that he turns out to have tremendous self-control. I'm open to that. I haven't seen it, and he's 70 years old, and it seems to me that as he acted in the campaign, he will act as president. I never bought the idea, which I heard over and over during the campaign, which is he would pivot, he would become presidential. It didn't happen. He is who he is, and people will like that or they won't like him. But I think people should do away with the illusion, what I think is an illusion, that he's going to change. And we've seen it with his tweets, and we saw it with the attack, the wiretapping with President Obama and so forth. I have been of the view, generally speaking, that character is destiny. A lot of conservatives used to believe that, but they seem to have made a U-turn when the Trump phenomenon came along, and it's less important. But it's character in the broad sense. It's not simply what I'm talking about is one's relationship, say, with his wife and so forth. Well, I don't think that's irrelevant. But it's a certain point of view. It's a certain kind of makeup. It's a certain sort of order of the loves and commitments, and how one acts and sees the world. And I've made my case, and I'm happy to make it again. But I think he's a person who is erratic and crude, in some respects cruel and vindictive, and not reliable. And I think he has a very tenuous relationship with the truth. And I think ultimately that plays itself out. And you can be right on the policy, and being right on the policy is good. But I think that if your character ultimately influences the rest of your administration and how you act, that is bad. Now, I may be wrong, and it may be that what I consider to be character flaws are confined to irritating tweets. And if that is the case, then that's great. If that can be contained, I don't suspect it is. But I can't have an investment in him being wrong. I have to be open to the idea that either my analysis is an error about his character, or that it can be contained and it doesn't become definitional to his administration. I will say, just as a general matter, pre-Trump, that I said over time that I believed that character, broadly defined, disposition, temperament, approach, is more important in a president than how they check the policy boxes. And part of the reason that I say that is because when you're a president, you get so many issues that you can't predict, and you've got to make judgments, wisdom, prudence. You have to be able to make analysis when there are 60, 40 issues. You've got to make really important decisions in a compressed period of time when not all of the evidence is there. And it's a complex equation, but I do think that that's central to whether one is a good president or not. And I don't believe that Donald Trump has those qualities. I think ultimately it will come back to haunt him. And again, I do think that the competence side matters a lot too. And I'm telling you, if you talk to people who deal with this White House, who want him to succeed, who they themselves have a vested interest in him to succeed, it's stunning the degree. It seems to be worse if you talk to people in private than is the public narrative, and that's a problem. He will be judged on results, and part of that is whether he can execute the kind of policies and the kind of governance, the kind of good governance that will make people's lives better.
Heather, Henry, either of you want to jump in on this question of character?
Sure. For those of you who don't know, because I don't know what they put in my bio, I actually grew up in Manhattan. It accounts for my limp, my twitch, and my hump. So my knowledge of Trump was exclusively derived from tabloids, from my earliest sentient days, reading about his latest scandal or bravado or outrageous statement. So I fully expected to find him risible, somewhere on the risible to detestable spectrum. And as I've observed the man, I've come to the conclusion that a lot of it is deliberate, and it's calculated, and it's stunningly effective. That my assessment of him was wrong, that I was wrong. I think one of the first things that I was surprised at was that he had good relationships with his wives. And then I looked at how his kids had turned out, and the fact that they weren't allowed to smoke or drink, and they all seemed to be really upstanding citizens, unlike certain other vice presidents' children, and who had admirable character, sort of. When the tape, the Billy Bush tape came out, I was surprised that it wasn't worse, actually. And I took note of the fact that he was talking about it not as something that he'd done, but in terms of what one could do if one were so minded. And when they were doing the fishing expeditions for all those women who were supposed to have been groped, I was so surprised that it was so mild. He'd kiss somebody. I'm sorry, I'm from an older generation. To me, this is not the end of the world that somebody kissed somebody else. Even if it was unwanted, this is not rape. This is, and it just, I was expecting there to be hordes of flings and affairs that would come out, and there didn't seem to be. You looked at his, I travel in circles in New York that can't stand Mr. Trump, right? We're not his target market. And they were always poo-pooing his wealth and ostensible value as a businessman. Well, I'm sure he's exaggerated, and that 10 billion is a number that is too high. But on the other hand, if you look at his career, he built buildings that nobody thought could possibly be built. He had an incredibly successful real estate career where people thought one couldn't have it. He then announced that he was going to become a best-selling author with no previous writing experience and became a best-selling author. He then went into television where he didn't have experience and announced he'd have a top television show and had a top television show. And then he announced to all the cognoscenti that he was going to be president, and they all thought that was hysterically funny. And look who won. And within that business trajectory, if you look at it, people are saying, well, he doesn't actually own the building. And I was thinking, yeah, he's gotten all of the income and none of the risk. That is a conservative, prudent, thoughtful business guy. I would like that deal. Much better than being the guy who builds the building and is in a lot of trouble. So from a temperament side in terms of what he actually did, as opposed to the bluster, which if you go back and read Art of the Deal, is very clearly laid out where he adopted that approach. And it was in watching somebody who should have had his head taken off for when he was accused correctly of something that he had done that there was no excuse for. And with sufficient bravado and going on offense, he got himself out of that hole. And Donald Trump has this light bulb moment of this is how you survive any kind of tough negotiation or people trying to get at you. And remember, this man grew up in New York real estate. There's not a tougher business out there where you are scrimping and scraping and negotiating and cutting deals and doing whatever you can to make it happen. Starting with, by the way, destroying whatever is there so that you can then build something else. It's not like you're starting with a verdant field out in the middle of nowhere. And so one expects that when he comes into Washington, one of the first things he's going to figure out that he has to do is destroy a lot of what's here in order to build what he wants to build. So I've looked at his character, and I see it from a very different perspective than had you asked me when I first heard that he was running for president in early 2015. I've seen how he talks. I understand why people deride it. But I also note how incredibly effective it is and how there's actually a science to it. And he's constantly A/B testing what he says. He says what works, and he uses it to great effect to persuade people, to help them see what he wants them to see, and to help them give him credit for things that he wants to get credit for. He may not be a nice man. I've never met the man. I have no idea. But he is a singularly effective one, and I would not bet against him.
Henry, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, when I think about his character, I just think about him as the political version of Madonna or Lady Gaga. That he is calculated to shock, but that is designed to give him power. And so I would agree, much as Madonna created a personality that made her the talk of the music world and made her extremely fabulously wealthy, that Donald Trump employs a similar tactic. But for conservatives, I think the more important question is not to get, or the more important feature is not to get wrapped up in Trump's personality. If Donald Trump, God forbid, died tomorrow, nothing changes. The political demand of his voters are still there. The conflicts between those demands and movement conservatives are still there. And by focusing on his personality, we actually obscure the real challenge that we have, which is how do we as movement conservatives adapt our philosophy to the needs and issues of our time so that we remain true to ourselves, but put together a majority that can move us closer to our goals. Donald Trump's personality doesn't change the challenge, and we need to be focused on the challenge, not on the person.
I'm going to shift focus for a couple minutes to the congressional Republican Party. Speaker Paul Ryan has been saying that one of the challenges that his Republicans face is that they've been the opposition party for 10 years. First, in the last 2 years of the Bush administration, when the Democrats had majorities in both houses of Congress, and then under Obama, and he's trying to get them to change that. And it strikes me that he's actually underestimating the challenge, because the congressional party was before that, in a certain sense, kind of taking orders from President Bush in a way that is not happening this time, because Trump has a different model of the presidency where he's not proposing his own health care bill. He's leaving some of these important questions to be settled by the congressional party with some nudging and cajoling here and there from him. And it seems to me that it's therefore a bigger challenge for congressional Republicans to figure out what exactly their role should be, what they should do. How should they work with President Trump? What should their objectives be? It's a big open-ended question, so take it any way you want.
Well, in the animal kingdom, there's territorial marking, particularly between two alpha males. And I think we saw a lot of that during the campaign between Paul Ryan and Donald Trump, each trying to vie for territory and power. And there's still a certain friction going on. Trump isn't giving direction directly, but remember, you had as one of maybe the very first gesture of the Republicans trying to change an ethics rule. Mm-hmm. And he, with one tweet, killed it, just killed it. He is now busy calling different members of the Freedom Caucus and elsewhere. And you saw today, if you were looking before lunch, that the American Health Care Act has now moved out of the Budget Committee and is going to the Rules Committee. And it passed with only 3 Republican defections, and had it had 4, it wouldn't have gotten there. So he is proceeding, and I will tell you that in the last 6 years that I've been spending a lot more time in Washington than I had previously, I had torn out my hair over this a little bit during the Newt days when I had been here before. But it has been so evident to me that Republicans do not know how to negotiate. And one of the things that I think that will happen with Trump is that they not only will learn what negotiating is, they might actually learn how to do it, which will be a very good thing for all of us.
I think the congressional party issue is actually a microcosm of the party issue, which is to say that it's very difficult to govern if you don't know what you're for. When you have a movement that is primarily defined by what you're against, it is very easy to be in opposition because you have a force that you're opposed to that's proposing things you can be against. When you govern, you have to be for something. And that means that you have to not just make the hard pragmatic decisions, but you actually have to have a theory of government. You have to actually have a theory that says, this is what we want to see the end result to be, as opposed to, this is what we will accept among all of the other competing demands. Republicans have not had that theory of positive what government should do in the congressional level since the 1940s. That's the last time you can see a successful congressional Republican majority legislating on its own when Harry Truman was president. Newt Gingrich couldn't put it together, even though he was a force of nature, and the rest of the Republican majority was basically a Congress that was ceding its role to others because they couldn't figure out how to move forward. Ronald Reagan never had that problem. When he endorsed Barry Goldwater in the speech that made him a star, there's a section of his speech where he says the liberal do-gooders always criticize, if we criticize their humanitarian aims, they always say we're against something, but they never say, we say we're never for anything. And then he goes on to say, we are for these things. And the 4 things he mentioned was actually 4 things that government should do. In fact, one of those 4 things was dealing with the question of the then proposed, not yet enacted Medicare. He says we're against a compulsory one-size-fits-all government program, but we're for telling our senior citizens that no one should be denied health care because of a lack of funds. And in my book, I've come across that sentiment, not just limited to senior citizens, but Ronald Reagan said that throughout his entire life, that no one in America should be denied needed medical care because of a lack of funds. That's directly relevant to the ACHA debate. But yet no one seems to have an idea willing to stand up and say, this is what government is for, and because we are for this, we are against that. Unless you have that, you can't legislate from Congress.
Yeah, it's unusual because in the modern presidency, the way that it's governed is that the president has weighed in. That is, that the assumption has been that Congress is very difficult to corral. You have lots of different factions that are going on. And if you don't have presidential leadership, it's often hard to put forward a coherent agenda and to work in unison. And that's really where a president has to come in and be able to say, look, this is the legislation that we're pushing. The leadership gets behind it, and then the rank and file follows. It is true that Donald Trump, for a variety of reasons, is following a very, very different model. I think we're going to see some of the chaos created by that in the healthcare debate, and probably in other debates as well. If you're not going to provide that leadership from the executive branch, it's going to require a certain degree of self-control and self-discipline within Congress to get it done. And I think Henry is right. I think that the Republican Party is in a state, and so is the Democratic Party right now, that there are different factions and real fissures that have developed that are quite complicated and tied to some deep movements in America in a transition time. And so I'm skeptical that Congress is going to run particularly efficiently unless you get executive leadership. I want to just say very quickly in response to what Heather said, I've never argued that Donald Trump won, so I haven't argued that he's not effective. I've argued he's morally corrupt, but I'm certainly open to the idea that people who are morally corrupt can be effective. My standard here isn't effectiveness. It's not a utilitarian judgment. Whether he's the way he has been because it's deliberate and calculated or it's inherent is less important to me than how he acts. I just think the record shows, and people will have to make up their own mind. I have to try and look at this as in a disinterested a way as possible. There is a public record and a private record with Donald Trump, and they have to make their determination on what they think. But I do think that the record shows that he is a chronic liar, and I actually think that matters. And I'm old enough to remember a couple of things, which is when conservatives argued for the importance of objective truth. That used to be a staple of it. And I'm also old enough to remember that character mattered when Bill Clinton was president. And I even know some of the people that argued that at the time, and it seems to have taken a secondary role. So I do think it's important in terms of intellectual integrity for people to be able to say, you know, if a Democrat did this, if Clinton or Obama did it, if they would have been critical, then if Trump does it, we're going to be critical too. And that people don't get so invested in the team or the party that they begin to erode the intellectual standards or moral standards that they would apply. And that's frankly been one of the things that's, I think, been problematic since Trump has been president, because I think a lot of people have hitched their wagon to him, and they're being forced to make arguments on things that not that long ago they didn't believe.
I feel like we should come back to Heather on this question if you'd like, or.
I don't see him as morally corrupt, and I don't have a problem with the bravado of exaggeration. And I think if you go back even to statements that he made about deporting Muslims, for example, there was always, if you actually got away from the headline version of the statement, he leads with the extreme that gets the headline, but then there's this paragraph or two that follows that nuances it and shapes it and leaves some exit holes and all the rest of it. And I view that as different than, for example, lying under oath. He has business practices that I find quite distasteful. So, for example, there are many people who say they have not been paid by him. But as best I can tell, what he does is he takes advantage of the law as it is written and pushes it to its extremes. So he'll say, okay, if you want to be paid, I'm going to argue that I shouldn't pay you and I'll challenge you in court. And people decide that they don't want to take on his lawyers. That's not how I would behave in business, and that's not how I would hope someone else would behave in business, and that's why I would never want to be employed by Mr. Trump. But it is legal, and I'm not sure that that's quite to the level of moral corruption. So I don't think he's as bad as he's been painted as being.
You have done such a great job that nobody has any questions. They just want to hear you keep talking. But I do have this one, which is, I think, a good one, which is that the left has become unhinged in response to Trump. What opportunities does this provide for conservatism?
I think we just saw one in the Hawaii court decision. You had a decision on an executive order that had been more carefully drafted, that had nothing in it that hinted of any kind of, profiling of Muslims or wanting to ban Muslims for being Muslims. And yet you have a legal opinion that has nothing to do with the law and is essentially overreach in an extreme way from the bench. Because they are so unhinged, they're going to be making mistakes like that that then sort of reveal who they really are and what their drivers actually are. I think they've hurt themselves on college campuses. And as much as we are all appalled at what's gone on, I think that the recent statement by Robbie George and Cornell West, as well as the professors at Middlebury College, the left is starting to marginalize itself. And I think that the hard left will probably control who runs in 2018, and they will make themselves even more fringe, and that will all redound to our advantage until they finally get a grip and say this is not a winning strategy.
I think it gives us the opportunity to create the durable majority that we've wanted to create for decades. We have to remember that Donald Trump only got a little under 46% of the vote, that in order to be a durable majority, you need to have the consistent ability to attract a majority of the vote. He has not demonstrated he can do that. But again, if he were gone, the challenge would still be ours. We have to decide, do we want to be a majority? Do we want to make the compromises necessary while still being true to the core principles that we have that actually allow us to govern and move forward and create the dominant force that sets the questions rather than responds to the questions? And I think their continued decision to double down on their own inanity gives us the breathing space to make those choices with a little less pressure.
I agree. I think much of the left has gotten unhinged at him, and I think it will hurt them, and it may well drive them to the left. I mean, it's a party that's already liberal, and as we saw in the 2016 campaign, it's moving further that way. And you have a man who is a avowed socialist who got close to defeating Hillary Clinton, and the energy in the Democratic Party was with the person who is an avowed socialist, and I think that'll hurt them. But I think the predominant issue, and maybe the overwhelming issue, really is with how Trump and the Congress performs. This is a Republican government, Republican president, Republican House, Republican Senate. So its fate is largely in its hands. And again, if they govern well and competently, people feel like the economy is better, the culture is better, internationally things are better, that the country is coming together. They just feel better about America and the course that the Republicans are putting on. Then the Republican Party is going to be in good shape. But if they feel like Republicans were handed the keys to it and they took the car and they crashed it, into the barrier, then they may be resistant or reluctant to go to the Democratic Party. But certainly in 2018, which tends to be a difficult year for the party in power, they may well take their anger out on Republicans. And if Republicans lose either the House or the Senate, life's going to get a lot more complicated for Donald Trump.
One thing I just want to jump in.
Now, I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring this to an end. I'm not even going to be able to get to my favorite question, which was contributed here, which is an all caps Russia, question mark, with a smiley face on it. We're gonna have to leave that one and all of your other great questions for future panel. But please do join me in thanking our great panelists today.
Thanks so much.